Okay, next government intervention in the market is public housing. So you notice what you notice, this is a heavily regulated market. There's lots of intervention in this in the housing market. This is nothing close to a free market in housing. And we'll get to zoning later, but you got the zoning, you got the height restrictions, you got this mortgage, you got this massive subsidy for home ownership. Now we're also adding on top of that public housing. So what's public housing? So this and the next thing are kind of examples, classic examples of policies that have good intentions that end up having bad outcomes or the outcomes not matching the intentions. Okay. Favorite saying of mine, policy outcomes don't care about policy intentions. Just because you intend to do something good, that doesn't mean that will be the outcome. So in this case, the intention is let's provide cheap housing for low income households. A bunch of people who are struggling to make it. Wouldn't it be nice if we just build housing for them? We're the US, we're rich, we can build some housing for them, let them live in there for really cheap, just maybe the cost of upkeep. Won't this be great? Good intentions. Okay. And so government starts doing this in the depths of the depression to start building housing for low income households. All right. Really, the policy gets some updates in 37 and 49. The end result is there's about 1.1 million units built from the 30s to the 70s. What happens is over this period, the population that is in public housing becomes much poorer, much more likely to be on welfare, and much more likely to be single parent uh, households. And by the 60s, people started to recognize something has gone wrong with our public housing. Our public housing, doesn't seem to be working, doesn't seem to be getting people out of poverty. The idea is, hey, we're going to give you some housing. It's going to help you, focus on your career, kind of, get yourself on your feet, and you'll move out of public housing, um, move on to move up the income ladder. What is happening is it seems to be concentrating poverty in areas and kind of creating these poverty traps. That seems to be the result. And so by the 70s, the government says, you know what, we're not going to do this anymore. We're not going to we're not going to do the supply side, building housing for people. Rather, we're going to switch our policy to the demand side, which is instead of building housing for people, we're just going to give people money for housing. Okay. What it was initially called Section 8 vouchers. So as I mentioned, this is a classic example of outcomes not meeting intentions. So what went wrong with public housing? Well, there's lots of corruption. So usually when you have the government running some sort of industry, what happens is there tends to be an impetus for corruption because you don't have that competition. Now, that's not to say that private industry doesn't have corruption, but there is a competitive element that keeps private industry accountable, that I have to offer some quality good at a low price if I'm in a competitive market, because otherwise someone will come along and put me out of business. So in this case, with the government doing housing, they're not really competing. They're essentially providing housing for low-income individuals. So there's lots of corruption. There's essentially that corruption takes the form of shoddy construction. Like, look, I can just give my brother-in-law the construction contract. He can skimp on the materials and we'll pocket the difference, that sort of thing. Or, the money is just, flowing to administrators who are not going to their salaries, not necessarily going into the unit. So we have lots of, shoddy construction, lots of corruption. And what happens is, you're basically the way what the public housing looked like was like big high rises. The stereotypical projects was these really, really big high rises. And, by definition, it's for low income individuals. So essentially what you're doing is you're concentrating poverty in these big high rises. And then people living around the high rises, start fleeing the areas. So you're also, then you're driving down the prices around the high rises. And so you're essentially concentrating poverty. When you build these high rises, you're concentrating the poverty of the city in one area and essentially cutting that part of the city off from the rest of the city. People know, okay, we're not going to go there. Businesses don't locate there. And so, what turns out to have good intentions, really the end result is concentrating poverty, leading to much worse outcomes for the people living in these public housing units. Essentially, there's crime and there's lack of economic opportunity. In fact, the public housing was so bad that when it finally gets demolished, so what happens is many of these public housing projects get demolished, and then the people who are living there get vouchers to go live somewhere else. The demolishing of this public housing leads to much better outcomes for the children. So this is research by Chin in 2018, who he shows that basically If we compare children who are living in public housing to children who live in public housing nearby that got demolished, they got to move out. Those children who got to move out, that got vouchers, they were less likely to commit crimes and more likely to be employed. This is kind of how concentrated poverty works. When I volunteered with the Big Brothers. My little brother lived in, an area of concentrated poverty in LA. And you can kind of see how this plays out, where his friends, his peer group, there's nobody, who's economically successful. There's nobody with a job. There's nobody who's trying to make their life better. So he has no direct role models. Furthermore, if he were to get a job, in the neighborhood, his friends would come and rob the place, knowing that he would not, tell anybody who did it. So then it was hard for him to get a job. It was hard for him to hold a job because his friends would rob the place. So you had that. That's how the concentrated poverty becomes a cycle. He doesn't have a role model to see, oh, there's a different way. There's a different way of striving, of getting a better job. And it's also inhibiting himself from getting a job in the neighborhood. So this is one of the reasons why concentrated poverty is bad. A much better model is to take, the low income households. Also, we have a bit of a misconception. Many people in poverty actually move out of poverty pretty quickly. It's only when you kind of concentrate them together that the poverty becomes endemic. So a much better model is to kind of distribute the poverty throughout the city, have much more mixed income neighborhoods. When you're doing public housing, that's virtually impossible unless you do public housing for the entire city. Okay, another example of good intentions with bad outcomes is rent control. Rent control is the classic example. So many cities have rent control. The idea of rent control is we want to give people affordable housing, so we're going to cap rents. Rents can't go above a certain amount. We'll cover housing subsidies in a second. So this in Econ 101, this is often used as kind of your classic example of a price ceiling. So what happens when you put a price ceiling in, basically the market wants to go here, you're putting a price ceiling in here, a shortage develops. Basically, more people want the rent controlled housing than landlords are willing to provide. So what usually happens is the landlords say, you know what, I can't make money at this low rent controlled price. I'm going to turn it into a condo and I'm going to sell it. If I'm a developer, I'm just not going to build housing. Why would I build housing when I can't charge the market price? I'll build condos instead, or I'll build single family housing. So the supply of this rent control goes down. Everybody wants to get it because it's way under market value. So a shortage develops. Furthermore, if I'm a landlord and I have, basically have a line of people who are willing to take this property, what's my incentive to keep it up? So the rent control stock deteriorates, the housing stock deteriorates because I have no incentive to make it good because I can just immediately turn around to rent it to somebody else who wants it. Another thing that happens is like lots of corruption that happens too, where I kind of maybe I'll charge a key fee. Maybe I'll say, okay, you can rent the apartment at under market, but you're gonna have to pay $1,000 to get the key. Or there are bribes going on. When I was an undergrad, I had a friend bribe somebody $5,000 to get into a rent controlled apartment because ultimately, if we're staying there for 4 years, it's a good deal in the long run. So you have all sorts of shenanigans going on when you have this when you put these price controls in. And ultimately, in the long term, it gets even worse. So in the long term, more and more of the rent control housing comes off the market as people turn it into condos or redevelop it as condos. Developers don't want to replace the old stock, and more people hear about the rent control housing, so the demand for it goes up. So this problem just gets worse and worse. And so, as I mentioned, we have all long lines, discrimination according to the seller's bias. We have all these bad outcomes. Good intentions. We want to give people cheaper housing. What the outcomes turn out to be is we get less of the rent control housing. And again, we're pushing people out of the area. As there's less housing, people have to find housing elsewhere. So there's a spillover effect where the rental prices in the surrounding area get pushed up because there's less housing in the rent control area. Okay, so the policy outcomes: poor maintenance, as we've talked about, a shortage. There's a shift as we move from rentals to condos, and then people, essentially being pushed out of these areas. Again, the policy outcome does not match the intent. There's tons of research on this. All the research essentially shows that the predicted outcomes happen. San Francisco is a classic example where they have rent control. What they find out happening is people never move out of the rent control, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but people, sometimes it's good for people to move to opportunity, move to other places, but they essentially get stuck in the rent control housing because it's such a good deal. Overall, the supply goes down by 15%, and we're driving up all the prices. So all the surrounding areas, all the prices go up. And so what this does is basically you have two types of housing in your city. You got the rent control housing, which is inhabited by low income people. And then you have everything else, which is super expensive, inhabited by high income people. So you have a growing income gap in your city. Essentially, you've gotten rid of your middle class. All right, you've priced out your middle class. They can't get into the rent control stuff, or there's just not enough of it, and everything else is high income. So you've removed the middle class, all right, which is basically what San Francisco. There's no middle class. Okay. Different option is what the federal government, when they pivoted away from public housing, they moved to housing subsidies. Okay. Now, the way these work is, so this is essentially the alternative. So public housing has bad outcomes. Rent control has bad outcomes. So how do we get low income people housing? All right. As we've mentioned, public housing had these bad outcomes. In practice, it turned into concentrated poverty. Rent control turned out to basically driving up prices for everybody else with low supply. So our third option is subsidies. So what we can do is just give people money. So if you're low income, you're under above a certain threshold, we'll just give you money for housing. This is easy to target. So hey, anybody with low income, rent control is hard to target. Essentially you're trying to target the low income, but basically anybody who gets into it can get into it. So this one's much easier to target. And then also the people could just make their own choice. Here's your money. As long as landlord accepts the voucher, you can live wherever you want. Okay. All right. And so what happens with the policy outcomes is this will increase supply of housing. Since we're giving people money, we're actually going to increase the supply, which should drive down prices for everybody. And so here, this is a good policy in that the outcomes, we want to give people money for housing, so their housing's cheaper. Okay, done. And actually, we're driving down the price of housing for everybody else because theoretically we've increased the supply if supply can expand. So this program, has its issues, but the big issue actually with this program is there's not enough of it. So it's really actually hard to get. If you have Section 8 or what's now called housing choice vouchers, it's really hard to get. I mean, my in-laws, my wife's parents were on it forever. Basically, my wife's entire childhood, they had Section 8 housing. They got off it because they moved in with the brother-in-law. Impossible to get it back. It's big mistake. Big mistake. Yeah. So that's the issue. The waiting list to get onto this housing choice voucher. This just not the funding for it isn't there, and so that's the big issue with this particular program. Okay. Lastly, we'll talk about zoning after a break.